children obey. The Greek word to obey means to listen intently. You have to understand the background. In the Roman patriapatus said the father has all power. He can sell, punish, farm out, choose a mate, and put to death his children if he should decide. That was Roman law. He had ultimate right over his own family. Ephesians 6:2-3 steps in and says, honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with the promise that it may go well with you and you may live a long life on this earth. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly so that you can see that. Then it turns to fathers and says, fathers, do not exasperate your children. Again, it turns now in the society where the father could ultimately have his child killed immediately at birth for nothing more than born the wrong sex, and just say, I've chosen not to have this child, to a place where it says, you have a responsibility for their well-being. Don't exasperate them. Even though you have a role over them to teach them. That concept of sacrifice is so different than we might see today. And then in the same passage in Colossians, what we don't realize is the same passage doesn't end there. We think that it's ended, the family little unit is complete, but it's not. In Colossians 3:22 it says, slaves, in all things obey those who are your masters on earth, not with external service as those who merely serve as pleasing men, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, do your work heartily, as for the Lord rather than for men. As for the Lord rather than for men. Knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. It is the Lord Christ whom you serve. For he who does wrong will receive the consequences of the wrong which he has done, and that without partiality. Slaves, obey. Why was this included? Because slaves were part of the household. I have them. It was all part of the whole order of things. It was all under the same household. He's gone out and talked about how we should treat the world. Now he's coming into the home and saying, okay, slaves. Now you have to understand that was radical because slaves were like saying furniture. He says there's a responsibility, a relational responsibility in the home with slaves as well. Some people have tried to make a huge distinction in the original words between doulos and dikaios. They really aren't as clear in their distinction, though there were certainly two classes of slaves. A slave and a servant. Different roles. The slave is owned. The servant is paid. The slave can't quit. The servant can quit when the indenturement is gone. The slave is not released. The servant is released at the payment of his debt. The slave can serve only one person. A servant can serve multiple people at the same time. The slave is passed as property from one generation to the next. The servant is treated as employed. Differences in their roles. But both belong to the household. The word that's used here is overarching for both groups. In Rome, under Augustus Caesar, 3 million slaves were there with a total of only 7 million in population. 3 million of them were slaves. Does that not shock anybody? Yeah. Of the population, virtually right at half were slaves. Jesus didn't change the circumstances. And sometimes that's what we think he came to do, is to change the hierarchy and role of his society. He didn't do that. Not as we might think. And what they were hoping him to do. They were hoping that Jesus would come and free them from Roman captivity. Make them no longer slaves. Are you with me? But Jesus gave this counsel. When they ask you to go 1 mile, go a 2nd mile. When they hit you on one cheek, turn the other cheek. Pray for those who despitefully use you. Submit to your governing authorities. Those don't sound like rebellion words to me. Those are submission words. You see, Jesus was more intent on the relationship rather than the role and position. I repeat, Jesus was more intent on the relationship than correcting the position. So much so that people have argued slavery in Scripture. Are you with me? They have, haven't they? And rightly so. If you follow the texts in the Old Testament, I mean rightfully so in the sense that they had texts to back it up on. Leviticus 25:44. And as for your male and female slaves, whom you have from the nations that are around you, well, from them you may buy male and female slaves. Hi out there. Did you read the text? Leviticus 25:44. It tells the Israelites they can buy slaves, as long as it's from another country. You can keep slaves. Verse 45. You may also buy some of them temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. Just regular everyday thing, right? What we always think of when we think of biblical endorsements of how life works. How do you do that? How do you deal with those texts? You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. But you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. That is, at least treat them like servants, not like slaves, even though they still can remain in your care. And you can treat the rest as property. When was the last time you heard that brought up in the sermon? Exodus 21:20. Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. So it's okay to beat your slave as long as you don't kill him. How are we doing that? Concepts of what we believe as Christians. How do I look at these texts in line with the roles that society has assigned? What I find is, it's the same thing as Jesus later does in Matthew when he says, you've heard an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Then he goes on to explain, using that passage, goes on to explain that when they are trying to use this to justify taking somebody else's arm or leg, he's saying, what I'm trying to do is limit how society allowed you in the past. Because somebody would come and they would step on your foot and you'd chop off their leg. Or shoot them. He's saying, I like to shoot. Let's at least be just. So he's moving it in that direction. And the same thing is here. What he's